The Appalachian Trail, stretching over 2,000 miles through the dense forests and rugged mountains, is often seen as a peaceful escape into nature. But what if the real dangers on this famous trail aren't the wild animals or the harsh weather? What if something far darker lurks beneath the surface, waiting to claim those who dare to walk its path? From strange disappearances to unexplainable encounters, the Appalachian Trail holds secrets that most people would never want to uncover. So, get ready, because tonight, we're going to explore 5 of the most terrifying true stories from this haunted wilderness. Stay tuned, and remember, not all who wander are lost, some are never found. The Appalachian Trail, stretching from Georgia to Maine, is known for its natural beauty. Towering trees, serene mountain views, and the gentle rustling of leaves, it's a paradise for hikers. But for some, the trail becomes a place of terror, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. This is the story of a solo hiker, Alex, who set out with nothing more than a map and the hope of completing the journey. What Alex didn't know was that the Appalachian Trail holds far more than breathtaking views. It holds secrets that have never been meant to be uncovered. It was early spring when Alex, an experienced hiker, decided to tackle the Appalachian Trail alone. He'd hiked in remote areas before, and the isolation was something he cherished. There was something calming about being alone in nature, surrounded by towering trees and the rhythmic sounds of the wild. As Alex made his way along the trail, he felt something strange, a sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, just the occasional rustle in the leaves or the snapping of a twig in the distance. But as he continued, the sensations grew stronger. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, tracking his every step. Still, he brushed it off. There were animals out here, after all, deer, squirrels, and perhaps even a bear or two. Nothing to be concerned about. But then, one evening, as Alex set up camp near a small clearing, he had an encounter that would change everything. A figure appeared in the distance. An old man, dressed in ragged clothes, standing just beyond the reach of the campfire's glow. He didn't move, just stared into the flickering light. Alex, unnerved but polite, called out, asking if he needed help. The man didn't answer. Instead, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "This trail isn't for you, boy. There are things in these woods, things you don't want to see." Alex thought the man was either drunk or delusional, and he dismissed the warning as a rambling from an eccentric. But deep down, a knot twisted in his stomach. There was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, as if he knew something Alex didn't. The old man turned and disappeared into the trees without another word. Alex stayed awake that night, the image of the man's eyes haunting him. But eventually, fatigue won over, and he fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Alex continued on his journey, trying to shake off the weird encounter. The trail wound through dense forests and steep climbs, but he kept pushing forward. Yet, as the day wore on, something felt off. The woods had grown unnervingly quiet, and that same feeling of being followed returned. Around midday, he crossed paths with another hiker, a middle-aged man with a heavy backpack. They exchanged a few words, and the man warned Alex to be careful, mentioning that hikers had gone missing in the area before, and there were whispers of something unnatural on the trail. Alex nodded, though he wasn't sure whether to take the warning seriously. He was an experienced hiker, and he wasn't about to let superstition get the best of him. By the time Alex set up camp that evening, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Shadows seemed to flicker and stretch at the edges of the trees, and the wind carried an eerie, almost human-like whisper. As night fell, Alex felt an unease creeping up his spine. He thought about the old man's warning, but dismissed it once again. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a snapping twig. Then another, and another. The footsteps were too deliberate to be an animal, too calculated to be the wind. Someone was out there. Alex grabbed his flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing, just the dense underbrush of the forest. He called out, "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer. Heart pounding, Alex jumped to his feet, scanning the dark woods. And then, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw it. A figure, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the old man, but something just as unsettling. A tall, gaunt shape with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Before Alex could react, the figure vanished into the trees. But the strange feeling in his gut told him this wasn't just some lost hiker. This was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The next morning, Alex was gone. A search party was sent out, but after days of combing the area, they found nothing. No footprints, no backpack, no trace of Alex. Just his empty campsite and the sound of the wind howling through the trees. Some said it was a bear, others claimed Alex had wandered off the trail, disoriented. But there were those who knew the truth. The Appalachian Trail is a place where people vanish, where the land itself seems to swallow them whole. And no one who has entered the deep woods chasing shadows has ever returned the same, or, in some cases, ever returned at all. What happened to Alex? Was it a wild animal, a supernatural force, or something far darker lurking beneath the surface? The Appalachian Trail holds its secrets, and sometimes, it keeps them forever. The Appalachian Trail is known for its diverse landscapes, rugged peaks, quiet valleys, and dense, shadowy forests. But there's one element that can turn even the most experienced hiker's heart cold: the fog. Thick, impenetrable fog that rolls in unexpectedly, turning the world into a blurred, disorienting maze. And sometimes, when the fog is at its densest, the trail hides more than just poor visibility. It hides things that should not be seen. This is the story of three friends, Sarah, Mark, and Lily, who thought they knew what they were getting into when they set out on their hiking trip. But nothing could have prepared them for the darkness that would envelop them, and the shadow that would follow. It was a late autumn afternoon when the group of friends began their trek on the Appalachian Trail. The air was crisp, the foliage just beginning to turn golden and red. The weather was perfect for hiking, and they were eager to push on for a few miles before setting up camp. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped quickly, and a dense fog began to creep in from the mountains. What started as a light mist soon thickened into a blanket of white, swallowing up the trail and blurring their surroundings. It was eerie. Quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were drowned out by the oppressive fog. Mark, who had been leading the way, stopped and looked around, confused. "I can't see the path anymore," he said, shining his flashlight in every direction. The fog seemed to eat the beam of light before it could reach anything. Lily, the more nervous of the group, suggested they turn back. But Sarah, ever the adventurer, was determined to push forward. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." The trio pressed on, but with each step, the fog seemed to grow thicker, and their surroundings felt more and more unreal. Every step felt like they were moving into an endless, white abyss. It was as though the world outside of the fog had ceased to exist. That's when it began. The first whisper came when they had been walking for what felt like hours, though they had no way of knowing. It was a soft sound, barely audible, like a voice carried by the wind. They stopped, looking at one another, but no one spoke. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the fog. The whispers grew louder, now distinct voices, though they could make out no words. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. Lily was the first to see it. There, just at the edge of the fog, a figure. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a dark silhouette against the white mist, but as it moved closer, it became more defined. A tall, thin figure, almost unnaturally tall, moving with slow, deliberate steps. The friends froze in place, too frightened to move. The figure seemed to glide effortlessly through the dense fog, and with every step, it got closer. There was something unsettling about its movements, too smooth, too silent, like it wasn't quite human. "Who's there?" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its long arms swaying unnaturally by its sides. Lily could make out features now, dark eyes that gleamed in the dim light, a face stretched too thin, like skin stretched over bone. And then, without warning, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving nothing but the echoes of its footsteps. The friends were frozen, unsure whether to believe what they had just seen. They turned to each other, trying to make sense of it. But before they could speak, the whispering returned, closer now, as if the voices were all around them. Lily gasped and pointed. "It's back!" The figure reappeared, but this time it wasn't alone. More shapes had materialized in the fog, several, all tall, shadowy, and with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the mist. In a panic, Sarah grabbed her backpack. "We have to get out of here, now." They ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, the fog closing in around them. The figures followed, always just beyond their sight, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Every time they looked back, The shapes seemed closer, though they could never see their faces clearly. The friends didn't stop running until they finally emerged from the fog, breathless and shaking, onto a higher ridge where the fog finally cleared. But when they looked around, they realized they had lost their way. The trail was nowhere to be seen, and in the distance the figures stood watching them, no longer moving, just standing at the edge of the woods. They quickly hiked to the nearest town, never speaking of what they had seen again. But the memory of those dark, glowing eyes haunted them, and they never hiked on the Appalachian Trail again. What were those figures? Were they spirits, shadows, or something far more sinister? And were they truly gone, or was something still waiting for them, hidden in the fog? Hiking along the Appalachian Trail is usually a peaceful experience, with the sounds of nature providing a calming backdrop to the journey. But there are places along the trail where the silence is not peaceful. Instead, it's filled with an unsettling tension, as though the air itself is alive with whispers that shouldn't be heard. This is the story of a group of hikers, Megan, Chris, and Ben, who encountered something on the trail that none of them could explain, something that spoke to them in the dark and followed them until they couldn't escape. Megan, Chris, and Ben were seasoned hikers, but they had never ventured deep into the Appalachian Trail before. They had heard stories from other hikers about eerie encounters, but they never thought much of them. It was just another day in the wilderness, after all. The trio set out one morning, their backpacks filled with supplies for a weekend hike. The weather was clear, and the first part of their journey was uneventful. As they hiked, the trail wound through dense forests and narrow paths that twisted and turned. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. But as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the atmosphere began to shift. The wind died down, and the usual forest sounds faded into an eerie stillness. Megan noticed at first the complete absence of any birds or insects. Then she heard something else, a whisper. It was so soft at first that she thought it was the wind, but when she stopped to listen, it became clear. Someone or something was speaking. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to Chris and Ben. They looked at her, confused. "Hear what?" Ben asked, pausing and scanning the woods around them. "I thought I heard a voice," Megan said, her unease growing. "It was like someone was whispering my name." Chris chuckled nervously. "Probably just the wind. Let's keep going." But as they continued down the trail, the whispers grew louder. At first, they seemed distant, as if coming from deep within the forest, but then they started to sound closer, much closer. The voices weren't clear at first, but there was a sense of urgency in the tone, a low murmur that tugged at the edge of their consciousness. It was almost as if the voices were calling to them, beckoning them further into the woods. "Did you hear it now?" Ben asked, his face paling. "It sounded like someone was calling my name." The three of them stood in the middle of the trail, each of them frozen by the unsettling feeling in the air. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding them. Each voice seemed to blend into the other, all calling their names at once, creating a chorus of strange, indistinct sounds. The sensation of being watched intensified, and the oppressive silence around them made their skin crawl. "Let's get out of here," Megan said, her voice shaking. She turned to walk back down the trail, but the voices seemed to follow, growing louder with each step. The deeper they went into the woods, the louder the whispers became, until it felt like they were standing right in the middle of a crowd, each person calling their name over and over again. But there was no crowd, only the three of them, alone in the forest, yet surrounded by the voices. They quickened their pace, panic setting in. Suddenly, Ben froze. His eyes widened in terror. "Look!" He pointed to a spot just ahead of them. A figure, dark and indistinct, stood at the edge of the trail, obscured by the thick trees and fog. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those eyes, seemed to burn through the gloom, staring directly at them. The whispers intensified, as if the figure was commanding them, pushing them to come closer. Megan felt her heart race. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The figure didn't move, yet its presence felt suffocating. The whispers began to grow more distinct, and Megan could hear her own name being called. But it was no longer a voice that was familiar. It was a voice she didn't recognize, a voice filled with malice, almost mocking her fear. Without thinking, Chris bolted forward, pulling Megan and Ben along with him. The three of them ran, not daring to look back, the sound of their pounding footsteps masking the whispers that still echoed in their ears. The figure, if it had ever been there at all, was gone, but the voices didn't stop. They followed them, just out of reach, as if they were caught in a nightmarish loop. It wasn't until they reached a clearing, with the moonlight finally breaking through the thick canopy above, that the voices stopped. The air felt lighter, but the sense of dread still clung to them. They had no idea how far they had run or how much time had passed, but they were far from their original campsite. The next day, they packed up and left the trail, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching them, following them, the entire time. They never spoke of what happened again. It wasn't until months later that they heard about similar incidents from other hikers, stories of whispers in the woods, of voices calling people deeper into the darkness, never to be seen again. Were the voices a hallucination, or were they something more sinister? No one could say for sure. But Megan, Chris, and Ben knew one thing. Some trails lead not just into the woods, but into something far darker, and the voices are always waiting. The Appalachian Trail is dotted with shelters, places where hikers can rest for the night, seeking protection from the elements. But not all shelters are places of comfort. Some are relics of the past, long abandoned, decaying, and shrouded in whispers. This is the story of a solo hiker named Ethan, who, after a long day on the trail, stumbled upon one such shelter. What he didn't know was that this shelter held something far worse than cold walls and broken windows. It held the remnants of a tragedy, a lingering presence that would haunt him forever. Ethan had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for days, enjoying the solitude and the challenge of the rugged terrain. He had always preferred hiking alone, finding peace in the quiet and the rhythm of the trail. As the sun began to set, he knew he would have to find a place to rest for the night. He had planned to make it to a designated shelter, but he had lost track of time while admiring the view from a high ridge. Tired and eager for shelter, Ethan decided to take a small detour and explore a more remote, less traveled section of the trail. It wasn't listed on any of the maps he had, but the worn path suggested others had come this way before. He followed it, knowing he would find a safe place to sleep soon. After an hour of walking, he came upon the shelter, old and dilapidated, its wooden beams covered in moss and ivy. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door hung off its hinges, and the roof was partially caved in, but there was still enough of a structure to offer protection from the elements. Ethan shrugged. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for the night. As he stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were covered in strange, faded markings that looked like they had been carved into the wood long ago. A shiver ran down his spine as he set down his backpack, but he dismissed it as fatigue. It was getting dark outside, and the wind had picked up, howling through the cracks in the shelter. Ethan decided to start a fire in the small, rusted stove in the corner to ward off the chill. As the fire crackled to life, he sat down on an old, broken bench and unpacked his things. But something wasn't right. As the fire flickered and the darkness outside deepened, Ethan began to hear faint sounds, scratching, tapping, and the creaking of wood, as though someone or something was moving around just outside the shelter. At first, he thought it was just the wind or the forest animals, but then the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Ethan stood up, heart racing, and walked over to the door, peering out into the night. The wind howled, but there was nothing there. He stepped back inside and locked the door, though it didn't provide much security. It was falling apart at the seams. The sounds continued, but now they were joined by something else, whispers soft and indistinct, as though several voices were talking in the distance. Ethan froze. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, as if begging for help. He turned to look at the corner of the room where the firelight barely reached. His stomach twisted into a knot when he saw it, a dark shape, hunched over in the shadows. It was small, almost human-like, but its features were obscured by the flickering light. The whispers grew louder, closer now, as if the figure was speaking directly to him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move. Slowly, it crawled across the floor toward him, dragging itself with eerie slowness. Its hands, long, bony, and twisted, scraped against the wood, and its head twisted unnaturally to the side as it approached. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "Help us, we never left." Ethan stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. The creature moved closer, its eyes now glowing faintly in the dim light. He could feel the temperature drop, the air growing heavy, suffocating. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by a scream, a human scream. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the sound wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the shelter, as though someone else trapped inside, was trying to get in. Panic surged through Ethan as he grabbed his backpack and bolted for the door. But as he reached for the handle, he felt something cold and skeletal wrap around his wrist, pulling him back into the room. The creature, now fully visible in the firelight, opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and hissed in a voice that sent terror coursing through Ethan's veins. "You should not have come." With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan wrenched free from the creature's grip and ran outside, not daring to look back. He sprinted through the woods, the sounds of the creature's eerie voice echoing in his mind, until he stumbled upon the main trail. By the time he reached the nearest town, exhausted and trembling, he couldn't shake the image of the creature, or the whispers of those trapped in the shelter. The authorities later investigated the area, but they found no sign of Ethan's experience. The shelter remained, abandoned and decaying, a dark reminder of what had once happened there, a place where spirits lingered, unable to move on. Ethan never spoke of what happened again, but every time he passed by the Appalachian Trail, a chill would run through him. Some places, he realized, are better left alone, because once you hear the whispers, there's no escaping the past. The Appalachian Trail is vast, stretching for thousands of miles through thick forests, jagged peaks, and lonely stretches where the only company you're likely to find are the shadows of trees and the occasional creature of the wild. For most hikers, the trail is a place to find peace, to escape from the noise of the world. But for others, it's a place where the line between reality and something darker begins to blur. This story follows Daniel, a solo hiker, who found himself walking a remote stretch of the trail late one afternoon, unaware that the encounter he was about to have would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the woods. Daniel had been on the Appalachian Trail for several days, enjoying the solitude that only nature could provide. The days were filled with the sound of his footsteps crunching against the dirt path, the wind whispering through the trees, and the occasional call of a distant bird. It was his escape, his way to leave behind the stress of everyday life. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Daniel decided to keep going a little longer. He had planned to camp at a spot near a small stream, but as he turned a bend in the trail, he saw something unexpected. A figure standing on the edge of the path, his thumb extended, waiting for a ride. At first, Daniel thought the man might be lost. It wasn't unheard of to meet other hikers or travelers along the trail, but this man didn't fit the usual profile of a fellow hiker. He was wearing a worn-out jacket, his hair disheveled, and his eyes, distant, almost vacant. Despite the warnings he'd read before starting his hike, warnings about the dangers of picking up hitchhikers in such isolated areas, Daniel couldn't bring himself to ignore the man's pleading expression. The stranger looked like he needed help. His clothes were soaked through, his shoes muddy as if he had been walking for far too long. After a brief pause, Daniel decided to offer him a ride into the nearby town. "I'm heading that way," Daniel said, motioning toward the road where he had parked his car. "I can give you a lift." The hitchhiker nodded silently, and the two of them began walking toward Daniel's car, the air growing colder as the evening shadows lengthened. As they drove down the winding mountain roads, the first few minutes were relatively uneventful. The man didn't speak much, his gaze fixed out the window, his face partially obscured by the light of the dashboard. Daniel tried to make conversation, but his responses were curt, his voice low. The atmosphere in the car began to feel heavier, colder, and more oppressive. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the car had turned unnaturally chilly, a stark contrast to the warm summer evening outside. Daniel turned the heater up, but it didn't seem to help. The temperature inside the car continued to drop, making his breath visible in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of driving in silence, the hitchhiker spoke. His voice had changed. It was rough, almost guttural, as if it wasn't entirely his own. "You shouldn't have stopped. You shouldn't have picked me up." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The hitchhiker's eyes, which had been distant and unfocused, were now locked onto him with an intensity that made Daniel's skin crawl. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where do you need to go?" Daniel asked, trying to maintain control, his voice shaking slightly. The hitchhiker's lips curled into a strange smile. You're already going the wrong way. Suddenly, the car's interior temperature dropped even further, and Daniel could see his breath fogging in front of him. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the car had become an icebox. He glanced at the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw it. The hitchhiker was no longer sitting in the passenger seat. Daniel slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. His heart raced as he looked around in a panic. The seat beside him was empty. The air was still cold, but the hitchhiker was gone. He quickly checked the back seat, his hands shaking, but there was no sign of the man. The road was deserted, and the trees on either side loomed like dark sentinels. Daniel's breath quickened, panic creeping in as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. He had been driving with the man only moments ago, and now nothing. It was as if the hitchhiker had vanished into thin air. Shaken and confused, Daniel drove back to town, but the unease lingered. He couldn't stop thinking about the hitchhiker. The strange way he had spoken, the unnatural cold, the way he had disappeared. Something didn't add up. The next day, Daniel stopped at a local diner and mentioned the encounter to the waitress, a friendly woman who had lived in the area her entire life. Her expression faltered when he described the hitchhiker. You're not the first to see him, she said, her voice lowering to a whisper. There's been rumors about ghostly figures on the trail for years. Some people say they've seen a man who hitchhikes up and down the mountain roads, but he's been missing for over 20 years. His body was never found. They say he still wanders the woods, looking for someone to help him. Just like you did. Daniel felt a chill run through him. He didn't know what to believe. Was the hitchhiker a ghost, doomed to roam the Appalachian Trail for eternity? Or was he simply a man with a secret, someone who had slipped away into the darkness, leaving behind only rumors and stories? The questions lingered in his mind long after he left the diner. The Appalachian Trail was a place of beauty, yes, but also a place where the line between the living and the dead could sometimes blur, leaving behind whispers of the things that might still be lurking in the woods, waiting to be found. These 5 stories are just a glimpse into the mysteries and horrors that lie in wait along the Appalachian Trail. With its remote stretches, ancient forests, and forgotten paths, the trail holds more than just breathtaking views. It hides stories of lost hikers, unexplained disappearances, and encounters that defy explanation. So, the next time you find yourself alone in the wilderness, remember, some places are best left unexplored. Because in the quiet shadows of the Appalachian Trail, you never know what, or who, might be watching, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. Have you ever encountered something strange or unexplainable on the Appalachian Trail, or anywhere else in the wild? Share your experiences with us in the comments below. Maybe you've seen something that can't be explained, or perhaps you've heard a whisper in the woods that you'll never forget. We'd love to hear your eerie encounters, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we tell ourselves when we're alone in the dark.